Welcome to the McDonald Homecare podcast series, episode 2. Well, welcome everyone to the second McDonald Homecare podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about family dynamics and how that changes as a person starts to need care. So if you're between the age of, say, 45 and 65, there's a good chance you'll be supporting an elderly parent or relative. And trying to help older parents can bring up many issues that you potentially won't be prepared for. And in many cases, you're having to juggle work and children and other responsibilities, as well as navigating this emerging caregiving role. So Leigh, over to you. I think you're going to give us some examples of what you've seen in your experience and how that can be managed through living care.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Alex, and welcome anyone who is listening to this. I mean, yeah, over the many years of sort of operating or managing and setting up living care services, most of the inquiries will come from the children of the ones who need the care. And often it's at a stage where they are quite burnt out for one reason or the other. And that's like you said, Alex, that has a lot to do with the fact that they're taking on a role that they really never sort of gave too much thought about, really. And so when we are taking these inquiries and talking to families, they're often, could be living with their loved one at that point. Therefore, they are really kind of distancing themselves from their own lives and taking on a full-time caring role in their loved one's own home, their mum or dad or their mum and dad's own home. So they've often sort of marriage-wise, children-wise, finances-wise, with work, these things they feel that they've had to push aside to take on this responsibility. And some of the biggest issues that we often sort of work through with the family members are this sort of sense of guilt, actually, that they need to take this on. This is their responsibility. However, it often gets to a stage when they've contacted us, it's because they realize they can't continue to do this. They can't assume this role as a permanent caregiver for a loved one and also still sort of live effective lives outside of this situation.
And I guess one of the things is perhaps it kind of creeps up. So it starts with helping out with doing the weekly shop and bringing the groceries in, and slowly it sort of develops and the need becomes greater. And then by the time you realize how burnt out you feel, it's almost difficult to find the space to step back and say, okay, how am I going to sort this out? You're so embroiled in it, in just kind of managing it and managing your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so true. It's like all of our lives. We take on little bits extra in our lives. Our capacity, slowly becomes, less and less. And the next thing we know, actually, we are, especially the loved ones are taking full responsibility, where it just started, like you said, with just a pop-in, shopping, picking up medication, whatever it may have been, the occasional sleep-in just to make sure when someone's come back from hospital. But yeah, you're right. It slowly becomes a dependency upon that son or that daughter. And I think that's one of the key things is that dependency. Most of the clients at their age really are not wanting or accepting they need sort of help from the outside world, So to have that from a daughter or son or another family member, they will often cling on to that.
And how much is it the case that someone approaching you and inquiring about live-in care is going from no care to almost, full-time professional care, and how much of it is people who have had visiting care, so 1 or 2 calls a day to say help with getting dressed and getting ready, and how does that influence things, and does it make it easier if someone's previously sort of accepted care in a smaller capacity of these pop-in visits than jumping straight in, or how does that work?
Look, from my own experience in running McDonald Homecare locally, most of the clients that we've taken on, and providing living care services for, it's been from just situations rather than a development of that care needs, really. So most of the clients have not been receiving that visiting care. And so people who maybe have coming out of hospital or having health concerns that warrants going straight to living care, permanent care, because the alternative is readmission to hospitals or going into sort of a respite or a care home situation. So most of the clients we take on really haven't had that journey of care. However, in my own sort of career, I've worked a lot with that visiting side and then sort of promoting living care as a natural progression from that. So I have definitely seen more openness to living care once people have accepted care on the outside. So a lot of the challenges we will naturally work through with the families and the clients is that it's going to take a little bit more time for that person to actually accept having someone living in their home when they've really been living by themselves for so long, by themselves, and so independent.
Yes, and how do you manage that? Because I guess there is that concern that the older person might have, is that they've had autonomy over what they do in their own home and what they want to do and when, and all of a sudden there's going to be ultimately someone who is a stranger to them living in their home. How do you work your way around that?
Well, I mean, it is both very complex and yet very simple as well. In the sense, what I mean by that is that the simplicity is that I myself need to ensure that I'm gaining as much information about that client, their lifestyle, their likes, dislikes, their history, so much sort of key information that I can then find and introduce the right person. Because in the history of doing this and the pitfalls of it, if you are just going down the road of, well, we will just introduce anybody because they're available, then what you'll do is you'll really set everything back, and it will be really tough to actually build up that trust again for that client. So the relationship side, working with the families, actually meeting with the client themselves, building that trust. So if they trust me, they will often then trust who I then represent or bring in to care for them. And the more that I know that person, as I said, the better then I am equipped to either recruit that right type of person or the team that we already have to introduce them. And I have to say, successfully, that's how simple it really should be. The complexities come where even when you have matched the right person, there is still, you still just have to allow this relationship to evolve, because it's a foreign relationship. It's not family. They don't want often someone living in their home. So there's lots of reasons why it does become complex, but it's all about just managing situations little by little instead of it sort of building up, really.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the things that you do is you set up a sort of initial trial period, don't you? Which helps kind of get around this idea of this is permanence. If I allow this to happen, then I'm stuck with it forever. It's not the case. And that trial period, I think, really helps frame it in a slightly different way. And then I imagine that most of the time, by the end of that trial period, people have become accustomed to it, actually really love the freedom that it's potentially giving them back, would be able to going out and all the other kinds of things, and the household is taken care of. Is that sort of along the right lines?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's always been something that I've advocated, because when you're dealing with, this person who, we're talking maybe in 80s and 90s and the life that they've lived, the independence and just who they are as a person, that they've often been through wars. That we're talking about this generation, and very independent, hardy people, and so for someone like us to come and say you need this and it's going to be on a permanent basis, and this is the way that it works, it's not the right way to ever set up a living care service. And so the whole trial period, or the whole approach, like, let's just see how this goes approach, you're not signing up for life, you're not giving your life away. It's just, look, it is just a sort of a short duration of time, so everyone sort of gets the feel for it, really. And that seems to be a nice way forward for especially the older client to accept.
And really what comes out of that then is actually it ends up promoting independence rather than what's potentially perceived about it, which is that this is going to take away my independence. And I suppose that also goes back to the kind of family dynamic issue that we were talking about, is that when you're helping your parents at that stage of life, that can bring some challenges into the relationships, and those good intentions can end up straining those relationships because there's this perception that you're reducing that person's autonomy and dignity to make their own decisions.
Yeah, and we work with families all the time, and even just most recently in Petersfield here, that the daughters of the client were taking on that full-time role for their mum who lives with Alzheimer's, and it just sort of was getting more and more, I guess her life was more and more at risk of being by herself at home. So they were noticing things, and they felt that they had to really step in at such short notice to then almost do shifts during the week. So between the two daughters, then they would be doing 3 days and 3 nights at a time. And so when it gets to that stage, and this is by their own sort of life story, really, when they've spoken to me, is that it's changed from a daughter-mother relationship to a caregiver relationship. And so, and no one, and that's not right or healthy for anyone, because the client themselves is, they don't really want to be sort of receiving personal care from their own family. They don't want to see their daughter as taking control of their lives and doing this and doing that. So, and from the daughter's side, that they were struggling. They were struggling to accept that this role was now upon them, that the relationship with their mother was completely changing, and also they were really struggling with their own life, with their own marriages, with being away from their own husbands and children and work and financial responsibilities as well.
So what have you seen when a living care package is then put into place? Are you able to sort of see how that relationship and that dynamic between the children and the parents kind of reverts back to what it was? So it is more that kind of mother-daughter relationship in the circumstance you're talking about?
Absolutely. And it's almost like a breath of fresh air, Alex. I mean, that would maybe sum up what the daughters of this particular client, but many, many other examples would feel like. It's not that they can just get back to their lives. It's more that they can relax, and there's that reassurance, there's that peace of mind, and just breathe again. I think, getting back to originally what we said, it's amazing how little tasks or little things that you're doing for mom or dad, then suddenly you're the full-time carer. You really haven't had chance. It feels like you've been suffocated very quickly. And so this whole chance to breathe again, to live again, and then that whole relationship now where, in this example, the daughters can just come when they want to, have their own time with mum again. They're going out, to the garden centres again for coffees. They're just doing normal mother and daughter relationship things again. And it's always a joy to see from that perspective.
So I guess one of the things then that comes out of this is, and this is easier said than done, is that kind of planning ahead is really the key to avoiding those kind of situations and reducing the stress of trying to make those decisions almost when it becomes an emergency. And I guess in that situation as well, that your care options end up being reduced if you need something to happen in the next week, 10 days, because you're just at breaking point, or there's been, a fall and mum or dad's in hospital and you want to get them home. I guess those are more difficult to plan for, but generally, are there sort of signs of things that people should be looking ahead to think, okay, maybe I need to start having some conversations with some local providers to see what's out there, to see what the options are, to know how long it takes to put these things into place?
Yeah, on a practical level, definitely. I mean, if people are seeing a deterioration, and that could be sort of via sort of that mental health side of things, someone taking care of themselves, they're not, mum and dad aren't maybe eating well, their nutrition, their hydration, there could be a reoccurring of infections, admission to GPs, medication, even hospitals. All those things are really telltale signs, and probably one of the biggest things actually is maybe more that loneliness and depression, which is a silent killer, really. So I think on a practical level, they will be sort of picking up on these things, and I think if they've got any sort of close relationship with their loved one, then they'll have their own sort of feelings that something's not right, something needs to be done. And again, it comes back to maybe that sort of guilt, or that lack of assurance that mum and dad are taking care of themselves when they're not there. That lack of peace of mind, worrying, so they'll be going through their own sort of journey about this as well. So if it's really got to those practical side of mum and dad's day-to-day life, and then your own sense of something's not right, something's going to happen, then I think, that those will be really good indicators to then start, like you said, looking at options of care in home.
Have you seen any sort of spikes in particular times of year where you get more inquiries? Because one of the things that we tended to notice on the domiciliary care side of things was after Christmas, and you've had mum or dad staying over for a few days over the Christmas period, and all of a sudden you've noticed that there's been a big change since the last time you saw them, or there's just that greater amount of time to notice that they've got more difficulty in, say, transferring, getting up out of a chair, or sort of their mobility and walking around, and that's a trigger to think, okay, we need to look into this in a bit more detail.
No, you're right. I mean, and I think that's the reality often, is that when there are those occasions during the year where you've got more sort of condensed family time, a lot of family members are seeing the reality that actually mum, dad has deteriorated in different elements of their life and their own personal care and hygiene and mobility, and able to manage. So I think that's a real eye opener, especially over Christmas. And there's also the conditions of infections over winter. Maybe the lack of appetite, the more hospital admissions that are going on during that time as well, the viruses that are going. So there is naturally, even in this whole seasons, that there would be more inquiries coming around that sort of New Year period.
So we've talked about children taking on the responsibility as the caregiver, but that obviously relies on them being relatively local, and I know examples of people that were doing sort of an hour or more's journey each way every day to try and support someone. But there's going to be times where the family is just not that close, or they're out of the country. So how does someone go about kind of managing that and making sure the right care gets put in place?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and many times there is that situation where the family, for whatever reason, I mean, even during this whole lockdown period, we've helped set up living care services for those who've been stuck in another country, and they would be very much in mum or dad's life, and therefore they've really had to trust to provide or set everything up from a distance, really. So we've had those sorts of examples, which is more sort of short term, because they obviously will be able to get back into the country at some point. But there's the other occasions where family members are living overseas, because examples that one of the daughters married a an Australian, and so they live full time in Australia. So their time when they do come over here is just for holidays, and so when they were here last, this is where they knew that they had to do something to put things in place, because they just did not feel safe that when they left, that their mum and dad were going to be, safe living at home. And because they knew they couldn't practically be there for them, they want to ensure that when they left, that they knew everything was in place. So, yeah, it's a difficult one if you're overseas trying to make this work, and because you're really reliant on maybe looking for providers that you've never really had any personal contact or recommendations from. However, if family are in that situation, then, and they can have physical contact with a care provider, like the example I've given, then I think that brings a real peace of mind that actually they've met us, we've met them, we're able to set things up. They understand what's going on. They understand the process. They've met the carer, and therefore they can then sort of leave the country with that sort of mostly reassured that everything is okay. But saying that, also, I think it's important to note that part of our relationship with the family is to keep in contact, by email, to set up, sort of video chats to make this very difficult sort of distant relationship work. And part of that actually is a peace of mind, is that when the living carer is there, that they can really facilitate their relationship. They can really make sure that mum and dad are having those conversations on a regular basis with their loved ones in different countries, setting up video WhatsApp, which typically speaking, the clients or would not have known about or have any interest of, but because the living care worker is there facilitating that, making that happen, it just really connects people, even it being such a distance away.
Yeah, I think those kind of things are a bit of a game changer, really, and you don't want that barrier of technology not to allow people to kind of use what it's there for. I mean, in my own family, it's incredible how much of a difference that makes, particularly with the elderly relatives that we've got living out the country in France. It's a totally different connection somehow than just hearing a voice at the end of the phone.
Absolutely.
You can see for yourself that person looks well, or that person doesn't look so well.
And by their own sort of admission, the family would say that the carer has become part of the family. It just, the relationship, when there is that trust, that natural sort of respect that's built up over time, they really do become part of the family. So when they're ringing through to talk to mum and dad, or things are happening, then that carer is part of that whole conversation, whole relationship, and it is a game changer, because the carers are really connecting their mum and dad with sons and daughters around the world, and that's through sending photos, that's just email updates, little text messages, whatever that might be, but that means so much to the family who aren't around physically to have that peace of mind.
One thing on that, I suppose, that might be a concern for people is that professional boundary, and how do you maintain that when someone is there all the time and there's this natural kind of absorption into the family? How does in your experience, the care worker manage that level of professional boundary? That's obviously necessary because they are there to provide a service ultimately.
Yeah, I think this is where the agency that they're working under, ensures that there is that maintaining that professional boundary. That's obviously very, very important. You talk to any living care worker, they're always told about personal boundaries and professional boundaries. However, the reality is, in a living care relationship that actually is working, then there's going to be a fine line. That doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It just means that the relationship's working, that they're not only providing the right level of care and support, but they're actually sort of taking on different functions within that role that as a living care worker, they've been given agreement by the families to do or by the clients to do. So with that, it can be that sort of contact with family. It can be that sort of taking photos and sending updates. So I think the professional boundaries is very important, especially when you're dealing with things like finances. There's some key elements around that and data protection. However, I think what the families and the clients probably love more than anything when that relationship is being built is that there's a sense that person is part of the home, they're part of the house, they're part of their lives. It just naturally flows, really. So, and I think that's one of the benefits and one of the reasons that we've set up McDonald Homecare as an introductory living care service, because it isn't just all about the sort of tick boxing sort of exercise and process driven care provider. It allows for there to be a more flexible and more relationship with the families and the carers, which, when it goes right is a very, very precious thing.
So from a practical point of view, obviously that one care worker needs a break. They have a life outside of the live-in care that they're delivering. So what does that typically look like? Because you're potentially having to introduce more than one person into the home. In a practical sense, what normally happens there?
There's a few ways of doing it, really, and that's why it's so important to sort of get to know the client, their lifestyle, the family's involvement or lack of involvement, and talking through the options, really. So I guess a few options, which are the main options, would be that actually there would be one main living carer that would be there for long periods of the year, and therefore we would, when that person had their breaks, extended breaks, then the options are that we replace them with a respite living care worker that would come in to fulfill those holiday breaks, or even at times the family have done that. They would be happy to take those sort of every so many months, weeks, and they would take that responsibility. So there's different ways of managing that. Or the other way is that there's a sort of a more fixed sort of rota where you've really got two living care workers supporting that client or those clients, and they're working on almost like a very sort of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or month on, month off, whatever the structure may be. And therefore, yes, there's two permanent living care workers that are working in tandem, really. So those are the main ways or constructs of a living care service.
And I guess something that determines that structure, whether it's 8 weeks on, or as you say, a more fixed pattern of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, is the level of care that a person needs. So whether if it's more companionship based, then the intensity of the care is not the same as if you've got someone with very advanced dementia, for instance.
No, absolutely, you're right there. It is all going, like I said, it's understanding that person's lifestyle, their care needs. And realistically, even though they may say, well, no, we don't want two people coming every 2 weeks, it's going to be disruptive. I think from a professional point of view, the duty of care that we have as the agency really is to navigate that and say, well, look, the recommendation is, because of the needs of that person, is that one person wouldn't be able to sort of provide high quality, high standard of care past 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So, that's our job to understand what's really going on in that home and the service that's needed and the care that's needed, and then to match and to organize a sort of a rota that makes it for longevity as well as continuity, really, because it's a very emotive sort of time in that person's life. So the family, the client may want the easiest option, and that may be to have someone there on a permanent basis or a long purpose. But actually, experience will tell you that actually the family really, or the client really, doesn't have that deeper understanding of how to make this work long term. And so it's really up to us to make sure that we can navigate that correctly, really.
Well, that's been a really interesting conversation. I think we've sort of delved this into some other areas beyond family dynamics, but ultimately it sort of all links back in a way, doesn't it? And I guess the key takeaway is if you're in that situation, or you feel you're getting into that situation where you're taking on more responsibility, and you feel you might need some support, is to start looking at that kind of before it's too late and you're so busy and so overwhelmed that it's putting strain on on your relationship with that person, and also your own family and work, potentially children, is to get in touch with someone like Leigh at McDonald Homecare and just have those exploratory conversations and see how live-in care or any other type of support might be able to help alleviate some of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, great to talk to you, Leigh, and I guess we'll follow up in a couple of weeks' time with a new podcast.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Alex. And anyone who's been listening to this, thanks for your time for listening.
Thanks very much.